I can tell where I am in this building without looking up. The floor changes under my shoes in tiny ways. Tile with a dull grip. Tile that's been waxed too many times and feels like it's trying to slide away. Then the narrow strip of old linoleum that still holds a little warmth, even at night. After midnight, the place has its own sound. Not silence, never that. There's the steady breath of the vents, the thin rattle of a ceiling panel 2 turns down, and the far-off elevator that always sighs before it settles. The emergency lights don't flatter anything. They make the corners look honest. They make dust look like it's floating on purpose. Lately, a few things haven't matched the way they should. The timing is off. A hum that starts half a beat early. A light that takes a second longer to fade. Little mismatches. Easy to ignore if you don't pay attention. I pay attention because I've been here long enough to notice when the routine stops lining up with itself. The wing I'm sent through at night isn't part of anyone's day anymore. It sits past a set of double doors with a narrow window that always catches the emergency lights like a cloudy eye. On the other side, the air feels thinner, like the building is using less of itself. I keep my cart quiet. The wheels complain if I let them. I've learned how to lift it over the door tracks, how to nudge it so the sound stays low. The corridor is long and straight, then it breaks into short hallways that run into closed rooms. Every door has a number. Most of the paper signs are old and curled. Emergency lighting turns everything into simple shades, bright enough to see what you're doing, never enough to feel comfortable. My footsteps land and then come back to me a half second later, a soft echo that follows down the tile like it's not sure if it should. I start where I always start. The first supply closet on the left has a handle that sticks. I shoulder it open and reach in by feel. Gloves, trash bags, fresh cloths, the sharp, clean smell of soap and disinfectant trapped in plastic. The rest of the hospital doesn't actually sleep. You hear the distant rolling of a cart, an elevator settling, the occasional cough that gets swallowed by walls. In this wing, those sounds come through faint and flat, like they've been pressed into the air instead of spoken. My work is simple. Keep dust from building up, wipe surfaces no one touches, sweep corners where lint and paper fibers drift in and settle, check sinks for slow drips. The rooms smell like nothing and everything. Cleaning solution, old paper, sealed supplies that have been sitting too long. In the first room, the bed is made but wrapped in thin film that rustles when my sleeve brushes it. The monitor beside it is dark. I wipe the window ledge and watch my cloth leave a clean strip through the powdery film. The sound is dry, almost polite. Nothing is wrong. In this part of the building, wrongness usually shows up as something obvious, a leak, a smell, a stain, a broken pane. I'm good at spotting those. I'm good at ignoring the rest. That night, the first odd thing was small enough to pretend it hadn't happened. It was in the second corridor, the one that bends right and ends at an unused station with a counter and a phone still plugged in. I was rolling my cart past it, eyes on the floor, when a light came on behind the glass of a room halfway down the hall. Not the overhead panel, a softer rectangle like a lamp or a screen. Dull yellow. It filled the room for a moment, and then it began to fade. No click, no snap, just a slow lowering like someone turning something down carefully. In the door window, the glow thinned until the emergency light's reflection took over again and the room returned to gray. I stopped with one hand on the cart handle and listened. There was only the steady breath of the vents, the far-off hospital noise beyond the doors, nothing in the corridor with me. My mind tried to build a bridge across it immediately, a sensor, a power blip, something miswired. This building has circuits older than their labels. Things flicker, things surge. Machines wake up for a second and then remember they're not needed. I accepted that explanation the way you accept the weather. Still, I walked down the hall. The emergency lights made the center brighter and the corners dim. My shadow slid along the tile floors, stretched and then shortened as I moved. When I reached the door, I leaned toward the small window and looked in. The room was empty in the specific way unused rooms are empty. Bed, chair, cart against the wall. Everything covered, everything tucked in, everything waiting. No screen glow, no lamp, no small indicator light in the corner. I put my fingers on the handle, cool metal, slightly damp from the air. The latch gave with its usual quiet resistance. Inside, the sound changed. The vent hum softened. My breathing sounded too loud. The strip of light from the hallway lay across the floor like a boundary line. I checked the simplest things. The overhead switch near the door, down. The counter, bare. The outlets, capped. Nothing plugged in. Nothing warm. Nothing that could have made that dull yellow rectangle. For a moment, the thought came anyway, uninvited. Someone had been in here just long enough to turn something on, and then they heard me and let it go dark. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the feeling of realizing you've been moving through a place on habit, and the place has started answering back. I stepped out and pulled the door shut until it latched. I went back to my cart. I wiped the empty station counter, running my cloth along the edge where dust collects in a neat line. I tied a trash bag even though it was barely used because I didn't want anything left unfinished. I kept waiting for the light to come on again. I kept expecting another soft glow in a different window just outside my vision. It didn't. By the time I finished the corridor, my shoulders had eased. The rational explanations returned and lined themselves up neatly. I even felt a little foolish for standing in that room like it was going to tell me something. When I pushed the cart back toward the double doors, the distant hospital sounds grew stronger. Somewhere, faint and real, I caught the smell of coffee. At the doors, I paused out of habit and looked back down the dark corridor. The wing was exactly as it always was, gray, still, and waiting. Then, right before I turned away, the phone on the unused station rang once. Just a single ring, short, clean, and then nothing, as if the call had been changed into its own silence. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't watch the door windows. I still did. It's not a choice you make, like flipping a switch. It's something your eyes do when they start expecting an answer. I tried to keep my attention on the floor, on the cartwheels, on the places where dust gathers in the same patient shapes. But every time I passed a room, I felt my gaze drift toward the narrow glass panel in the door, waiting for that soft rectangle of yellow to appear again. It didn't. Not at first. The wing looked normal in the same way it always looks normal. Emergency lighting, dim strips along the baseboards, a few ceiling panels that never quite sit flush. The air hallway cool and dry, with a faint chemical smell that's stronger near the supply closet and weaker the farther you go. I opened the closet and did everything in the usual order. Gloves, bags, cloths. I checked the bottle caps, tightened one that had loosened. I listened to the cartwheels as I pushed out, keeping them from rattling against the door frame. I told myself the ringing phone was nothing, a test line, a cross-connection, someone on another floor pressing buttons out of habit. The hospital is full of things people do without thinking. That didn't mean anything had changed in the wing. But my body had kept the memory anyway. I noticed it in small ways. My shoulders stayed a little higher. I kept my jaw tight without realizing it. When I wiped surfaces, I did it slower, like I was trying to hear what the cloth sounded like as it moved. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was a kind of listening. Halfway down the second corridor, I paused by the unused station. The phone sat exactly where it had been, the cord curled like a tired muscle. The little message light wasn't on. Everything about it suggested it had done nothing all day and would do nothing all night. I didn't touch it. I didn't pick it up. I just watched it for a few seconds. Then I pushed on. The first disturbance of the night didn't come as light. It came as a sound. A single beep far away, thin and precise. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of beep you might not even notice if you were distracted. One note, held for a fraction of a second, then gone. After it ended, the vent hum filled the space again as if it had been waiting for permission. I stopped, my cloth in my hand, mid-wipe. The beep had direction. That was the problem. It didn't float. It came from somewhere deeper in the wing, from one of the hallways that turns away and narrows. I stood still long enough for my breathing to calm. I waited for another beep. Nothing. My mind tried to file it under the same category as the other things: equipment testing, a battery warning, a sensor waking up because of vibration in the floor. There are dozens of machines in a hospital that make single sounds when they wake and then go back to sleep. But this beep wasn't muffled. It didn't sound like it came through walls. It sounded like it was in the same air as me, like it belonged to the corridor, even if it wasn't in my line of sight. I finished wiping the counter. I tied the trash bag. I did the routine steps in the routine way, trying to keep my hands steady. Then, because pretending doesn't work forever, I took my cart and pushed it toward the narrow hallway. The temperature changed before I reached the turn. It wasn't a dramatic drop. It was subtle, like passing an open refrigerator in a grocery store aisle. Cold slid over my face and hands. The air smelled sharper, less like cleaner and more like metal. I slowed down. The emergency lights were the same, the floor tiles were the same, but the air wasn't. That's what bothered me most. The building has one consistent feel at night: dry, recycled air, slightly warm from constant circulation. This felt like a pocket of something else, like a layer of air had been stored here and never mixed properly with the rest of the place. I stopped at the corner and looked down the narrow hall. 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right. The far end ended in yet another closed set of double doors with a push bar leading into an area I didn't need to enter. Usually I didn't. Tonight, a faint green indicator light was glowing from a room on the right. Not a bright light, not the overhead panel, just a small dot, the way a powered device marks itself as awake. It blinked once, then it went steady again. I stared at it longer than I meant to. The cold in the hallway made the back of my neck tighten. My hands felt stiff, like the joints had been chilled. I told myself the device was on a backup circuit, that it could power up briefly if the system ran a self-check, that it meant nothing. Still, I pushed my cart forward. As I moved, my footsteps changed. The tiles here were slightly different, older, with more texture, less shine. My shoes made a duller sound. The echo sounded closer, as if the walls weren't letting it travel as far. I reached the door with the green dot. The window showed the room as it always was: bed, chair, counter. Nothing moving. The green light wasn't coming from anything I could see through the window. It had to be behind the counter, or beneath the bed, or in some place the emergency light didn't reach. I stood with my hand on the door handle for a moment, feeling the cold metal, letting the stillness press in around me. Then I opened it. Inside, the air was even colder. Not damp, not drafty, just cold, like the room had been kept at a different setting. I stepped in and pulled the cart just past the threshold. The green dot was on the monitor stand. The screen itself was dark, but the tiny indicator light on the lower edge was lit, as if it had been turned on and then put to sleep. I didn't touch it. I didn't press any buttons. I just looked at it and listened. No beep, no hum from the monitor, no click of relays. Just the vent hum from somewhere above, and my own breathing, slow and careful. I wiped the counter anyway, because my hands needed something to do. The cloth moved across the surface, leaving a wet shine that quickly dulled in the emergency light. I wiped the chair arm. I wiped the window ledge. The green dot stayed steady. I backed out and closed the door. As soon as it latched, the green dot went out. That was the moment my rational explanations began to fray. Not because a light went out, lights go out all the time, but because it waited. It stayed on while I was inside, and it turned off when I left. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door window, as if the room might confess something if I watched long enough. A beep sounded again. This time it came from behind me, back toward the main corridor. Same note, same length, clean and precise. My throat went dry. I turned slowly, cart handle cold under my palm. The narrow hallway behind me was empty. The emergency lights made the middle bright and the corners dim. No movement, no shadow shifting in a way it shouldn't. Another beep followed, identical. Then, after a pause, the same beep again. 3 notes, evenly spaced. It wasn't random. It wasn't a single warning chirp. It was a sequence, like a pattern someone would recognize if they were meant to. I waited for a 4th. It didn't come. The silence afterward felt thicker than before, as if the hallway had absorbed something and now was holding it. I pushed my cart back toward the main corridor. My wheels sounded too loud. The cold faded as soon as I rounded the corner, like I'd stepped out of an invisible boundary. Back at the unused station, I stopped. The phone sat still. No ring, no light, just plastic and dust, and a cord that looked like it had never carried a real voice. I leaned close and listened anyway, which made me feel ridiculous. Nothing. I finished the wing quicker than usual. Not sloppy, never that. Just efficient, like I wanted the routine to close around me again and keep me safe inside its predictability. When I reached the double doors, I hesitated. I looked back down the corridor. In the distance, one of the door windows held a faint glow, soft and yellow, like a screen on low brightness. It wasn't the same room as the night before. It was further down, closer to the narrow hallway where the air had gone cold. The glow didn't fade right away. It held, steady and patient, as if it wasn't afraid to be seen. I stood there with my hand on the push bar for a moment, feeling the cold metal, letting the stillness press in around me. Then I opened it. And in the silence that followed, somewhere deep in the wing, the same 3 beeps sounded again. The 3rd night, I arrived already tired. Not the heavy kind of tired that comes from missing sleep. It was a thinner exhaustion, the kind that settles behind your eyes and makes everything feel slightly delayed. My thoughts lagged a fraction of a second behind what I was doing. My body felt like it was moving on memory more than intention. Sometimes that kind of tiredness makes routine comforting. Sometimes it makes routine feel fragile. I noticed the hum of the vents before I even passed through the double doors. It sounded slightly uneven, like a long breath that couldn't quite decide when to end. The emergency lights flickered once as I pushed inside, then steadied. My shadow slid across the tile and broke apart at the seams between squares. I paused longer than usual, listening. No beeps, no ringing, just the building breathing around me. I told myself that was a good sign. I opened the supply closet. The handle stuck, then gave. Gloves, bags, cloths. Same order, same smells, same faint chemical bite in the back of my throat. I tightened a bottle cap even though it was already tight. When I rolled the cart out, the wheels squeaked once before settling into their familiar muted rhythm. That sound made me flinch. That bothered me more than the sound itself. The wing looked unchanged. Long corridor, closed doors, emergency lights stretching into dim repetition. The floor held the faint ghost of old mop streaks that never quite vanish no matter how many times you go over them. I started the first room. The plastic film on the bed rustled softly under my sleeve. The counter reflected the light in a dull smear. The window ledge gave up a thin line of gray dust that clung to the cloth. Normal. The second room was the same. I found myself listening between every movement, between the swipe of cloth and the lift of my hand, between the shift of my weight and the echo of my step. Silence began to feel segmented, as if it came in pieces instead of as a whole. By the time I reached the unused station, my shoulders ached from being held slightly too high. The phone sat quiet. I stared at it longer than necessary, waiting for the small betrayal of a ring or a flicker of light. Nothing happened. I turned away, annoyed with myself for expecting something. That was when the beep came. Not from deep in the wing this time, not from behind me, from above. A single clean note, faint but unmistakable, like it had come from the ceiling space directly overhead. I froze. The sound ended quickly, leaving the vent hum to fill the gap. I looked up at the ceiling panels. Most of them were off-white with hairline cracks and faint stains from years of air movement and condensation. One panel near the station was slightly darker than the rest, as if it had absorbed more dust. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it could have come through the ductwork. Sound travels strangely in large buildings. A beep from somewhere else could bend its way through vents and arrive above me like a trick of geometry. Still, I felt a subtle pressure in my chest, the kind that comes from holding a breath you didn't realize you were holding. I moved on. The narrow hallway waited where it always did, turning away from the main corridor like a thought you try not to finish. As I approached, the temperature shift met me earlier than the night before. The cool air brushed my face before I reached the corner. My fingers stiffened slightly around the cart handle. The boundary felt sharper now, more defined. I stopped at the corner and let one foot cross into the colder air. It was immediate. Not painful, not shocking, just different enough to feel deliberate. I pulled my foot back. Warm. I pushed it forward again. Cold. The line between the two felt thin, almost clean, like a drawn edge you could trace if you wanted to. I stood there longer than I should have, testing the air with small movements, as if the hallway were a shallow pool and I was checking its depth. Nothing changed. The green indicator light was already on. Same room as the night before. Same small, steady dot glowing in the dim. It didn't blink this time. It simply waited. My stomach tightened in a slow, controlled way, like a muscle preparing for strain. I pushed the cart into the cold. The air wrapped around my hands and wrists. My breath felt louder in my ears. The sounds of the main corridor dulled, as if the colder air swallowed vibration more quickly. My footsteps sounded closer again. My echo returned faster. When I reached the door, the green dot was still steady. I rested my palm on the handle and felt the metal steal a little heat from my skin. I opened the door. Inside, the cold was deeper than the hallway, as if the room were layered inside its own temperature. The green dot glowed from the monitor stand. The screen stayed dark. I watched it for several seconds, half expecting it to react to my presence the way it had the night before. It didn't. I wheeled the cart in. The room felt smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, just closer. The walls felt nearer. The ceiling felt lower. The space felt more contained, like sound and air didn't move as freely. I wiped the counter. I wiped the chair. I wiped the window ledge. My movements were slower than usual, measured and careful, as if I were trying not to disturb something just out of sight. The green dot didn't change. When I finished, I backed out. The moment the door latched, the green dot stayed on. That was new. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. It stayed lit. A quiet unease spread through me, slow and steady. I took one step away from the door. The green dot went out. I stopped. It stayed dark. I stepped back toward the door. The green dot came back on, not gradually, instantly, as if distance itself had become a switch. My mouth went dry. I tested it again. 1 step away, dark. 1 step closer, light. The response was perfect. No delay, no flicker, no uncertainty.
I stood there, my hand hovering uselessly near the cart handle, feeling a strange sense of being measured. Not watched, measured, as if the room were learning the shape of how close I was allowed to be. The beep came then, not from above, not from behind, from inside the room. One clean note, thin and precise, vibrating faintly in the cold air. I didn't move. A second beep followed, same spacing, same tone. A third beep followed, 3 notes. The pattern settled into the space like something finished. I backed away slowly. The green dot went dark as I increased the distance. The beeps did not repeat. The silence afterwards felt too organized, too arranged, like it had been put back into place. I turned and pushed the cart out of the narrow hallway. The warmth of the main corridor felt unreal on my skin, like I'd stepped out of shade into sun, even though the lighting hadn't changed. My breathing was shallow. I had to remind myself to slow it down. At the unused station, the phone remained silent. I avoided looking at it directly. I finished the rest of the wing on autopilot. My hands performed the routine without my mind fully participating. I wiped, I swept, I checked corners, I tied bags. My attention kept drifting back to the cold line in the hallway, to the way the light responded to my distance, to the beeps that had sounded from inside a room that wasn't supposed to speak. When I reached the double doors, my hands hesitated on the push bar. I didn't want to turn my back on the wing. I also didn't want to look at it again. I compromised by glancing sideways. The corridor looked empty and calm. No lights glowing, no movement, no sound beyond the vent hum. But the air felt different now, even here. Not colder, not warmer, just slightly expectant, like the space itself had learned the timing of my footsteps and was waiting for me to come back and confirm what it already knew.
By the 4th night, I had started doing something I didn't like admitting to myself. I was mapping it. Not on paper, not with marks or notes, just in my head, the way you remember the layout of a familiar place. Except now I was remembering it as 2 places, the wing I used to know and the wing that behaved differently in certain strips of air. I found myself counting steps without meaning to. I found myself watching the emergency lights for tiny variations in brightness. I listened to the vent hum the way you listen to someone breathing in the next room, trying to tell if they're awake. At the double doors, I stopped before pushing in. The narrow window showed the corridor washed in gray. Nothing glowing, no movement. I pushed through anyway. The air felt normal at first, which should have been comforting. Warm, recycled, faintly chemical. The vent overhead steady, my cartwheels quiet, my hands steady enough. I moved through the first corridor, wiped what needed wiping, swept what needed sweeping, and tried to keep the routine intact. When I reached the unused station, the phone sat silent and dead-looking. No message light, no ring. It wasn't a normal sound a phone makes. It was a single electronic tone, thin and flat, like the phone had been asked a question and answered with the simplest possible signal. My hand stopped on the counter, cloth frozen mid-swipe. For a moment, the only sound was the vent hum and the faint distant hospital movement beyond this wing. Then the phone did it again. Same tone, same length. A second beep, spaced exactly like the pattern I'd heard in the cold hallway. My throat tightened. I waited for the third. It came. 3 notes, evenly spaced, as if the wing were confirming a measurement. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't pick it up. I didn't press any buttons. I just stared at it, feeling stupidly exposed, as if the air around me had shifted in response to the sound. When the beeps ended, the phone went back to being plastic and dust and silence. I forced myself to move. I finished wiping the station, not because it mattered, but because my hands needed motion. Then I pushed the cart toward the narrow hallway. The cold boundary was waiting earlier again. I felt it brush my face before I reached the corner. It was sharper now, more definite, like a line drawn with intention.
I stopped at the edge and watched the floor tiles, as if the cold might be visible if I stared hard enough. Nothing looked different. I crossed anyway. The cold wrapped my hands and forearms, seeping through my sleeves. My breath felt louder, and my echo returned quicker, compressed by the closer-feeling walls. The green indicator light in the room was on, steady. It didn't blink. I didn't go straight to it this time. Instead, I kept pushing forward to the far end of the hallway, toward the closed double doors I usually avoided. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe, or a growing irritation at being pulled around by signals I couldn't control. The doors were heavy and old. The push bar had a dull smear of fingerprints on it, like a memory of hands that no longer came here. I put my palm on the bar. It was cold, but not like the cold hallway. This was just metal. I pressed. The doors didn't open. Not locked in the obvious way. They gave slightly, then stopped, like something on the other side was holding them shut. I leaned my weight into them. Nothing. I stepped back, breathing slower on purpose, and looked at the thin window set into one door. Darkness on the other side. No emergency light spill, no movement, just a black that felt too complete, like the other area had been cut out of the building's normal systems. I stood there, listening. 3 beeps sounded again. Not from behind me, not from the room with the green dot, from beyond the doors. Muted, but clear enough to recognize. My skin prickled. I moved my ear closer to the window, as if that would help. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint electronic pattern repeating, then stopping. I backed away from the doors, careful and slow.
When I turned, the green dot in the room was still visible down the hallway, steady, waiting. I pushed my cart toward it. As I approached, the air felt heavier, not thicker, just closer, like the space didn't want to let sound travel far. At the door, I stopped. This time, I didn't touch the handle right away. I leaned in and looked through the window. The room looked empty and still, bed covered, chair tucked in, counter clean from the previous nights. But something had changed. There was a second light. Very faint, almost nothing. A pale glow low to the floor, under the bed frame, like a device had been left running down there. It wasn't bright enough to reveal the device itself, just bright enough to make a small oval of light on the tile. My mouth went dry. I opened the door. The cold inside was sharp enough to make my teeth ache. The green dot stayed on. The pale glow under the bed stayed steady. I pulled the cart in, then stopped, as if the room had given me an invisible boundary. I could feel my pulse in my hands. I didn't want to kneel. I didn't want to put my head near the floor. I didn't want to reach under the bed where I couldn't see. But the light was there. The light wasn't supposed to be there. I set my cloth down on the counter, slowly, carefully. Then I crouched. The tile was cold through my pants. The air smelled like metal again, and something else, something faintly sweet and stale, like old plastic warmed too many times. I leaned forward and looked under the bed. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The emergency light didn't reach far beneath the frame, and the pale glow created its own shallow shadows. Then my eyes adjusted. There was a cable. Not thick, not industrial. A simple cord running from beneath the bed toward the wall outlet. Except the outlet was capped. Except the cord didn't go into it. The cord ended in the air, a few inches from the wall, as if someone had unplugged it and left it hanging. And the pale glow under the bed was still on. I stared at that small, impossible gap, the end of the cord floating near the outlet like a paused gesture. I reached toward it without thinking. My fingers stopped an inch away. Not because anything pushed me back, because the air around the cord felt colder than the rest of the room, as if the space there held its own temperature. I pulled my hand back. The pale glow flickered once. not like a power struggle, more like a response. I stood up too quickly, dizzy for a second. The room felt smaller again, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The green dot on the monitor stand blinked once. Then it went steady again. 3 beeps sounded from inside the room, clean and precise, vibrating faintly in the cold air. And this time, after the 3rd beep, a 4th sound followed. Not a beep, a soft click, like a latch engaging. I looked at the door. The handle was still in place. Nothing visibly changed, but when I put my hand on it and tried it, the handle didn't give. It wasn't locked with a satisfying click. It was held, firmly, quietly, like someone on the other side was pressing their hand against it. I stood there in the cold room, my cart beside me, the pale glow under the bed steady, the green dot watching distance, and realized with a slow, sick clarity that the wing wasn't just reacting anymore. It was deciding.
The door opened without a sound. Not suddenly, not with a release of tension. It simply stopped resisting, like a hand had been lifted away from the other side and forgotten. I didn't move for a few seconds. The green dot on the monitor stayed steady. The pale glow under the bed remained faint and contained. The cold air still pressed against my skin. Nothing else happened. I tested the handle again, gently this time. It turned easily. The latch slid back with its usual quiet obedience. I opened the door and pushed the cart out into the hallway. The temperature changed immediately. The cold peeled away from my arms and face, replaced by the familiar dry warmth of the main corridor. The air smelled like cleaner again, instead of metal and stale plastic. Behind me, the green dot went out. I didn't look back at the room. I didn't want to see whether the pale glow was still there or not. I pushed the cart forward and kept moving, letting the normal sounds of the wing fill my ears. Vent hum, distant rolling somewhere far beyond the double doors, the soft complaint of rubber wheels on tile. My breathing slowed on its own. Nothing followed me. I finished the rest of the wing carefully, almost reverently, like you move through a place after a near miss. I wiped surfaces that were already clean. I checked corners twice. I tied bags neatly. I didn't rush, but I didn't linger either. There were no more beeps. No lights came on behind glass. No cold patches waited in the hallways. By the time I reached the double doors, the wing felt exactly the way it used to. Quiet, predictable, empty in the ordinary way. I paused with my hand on the push bar and looked back one last time. The corridor was gray and still. Emergency lights held their steady glow. Door windows reflected nothing but shadow and faint dust in the air. It could have been any night from before. The walk back through the active part of the building felt louder than usual. The sounds of life and motion pressed in around me. Footsteps, distant voices, carts moving over tile. My ears felt like they were adjusting to a different world. Later, at home, the quiet didn't feel the same. My apartment has its own familiar sounds, pipes ticking, a refrigerator that hums unevenly, the soft rush of air when the heater cycles on. Usually those sounds settle me. That night, they felt arranged. Not loud, not wrong, just placed. I lay in bed and listened longer than usual. I found myself counting the seconds between the refrigerator's low vibration cycles. I noticed the heater starting half a beat earlier than expected. I noticed how the silence between sounds felt just a fraction too clean. I told myself I was tired. I told myself my nerves would settle. Eventually, sleep came. The next shift was ordinary. No strange lights, no beeps, no cold air boundaries. The unused wing behaved like an unused wing again. Quiet, empty, uninterested in my presence. The phone stayed silent. The monitor screen stayed dark.
The air stayed consistent from one end of the corridor to the other. A small part of me relaxed. A smaller part didn't, because the routine felt slightly off now in a way I couldn't locate. The timing of my footsteps felt subtly misaligned with their echoes. The vent hum felt just a fraction too patient. The emergency lights seemed to hold their brightness a heartbeat longer than they used to. Tiny things, easy to dismiss. The kind of details you only notice when you've spent too long paying attention. On the third normal night, as I pushed my cart past the unused station, I heard a sound that made my hand tighten around the handle without thinking. Not a beep, not a ring, a soft click. Brief, controlled, somewhere deep in the wing, like a latch testing itself. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I kept moving forward, letting the ordinary sounds of the building close over it. But the timing stayed with me, and sometimes, when the place is very quiet, I still catch myself listening for 3 notes that never quite come, and for a 4th sound that might already be waiting.